Anand, hello.
How are
There's so
you?
much to talk about. Well, I'm
I know.
okay. I've been better. I'll tell you, between fires and plagues and Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying and Donald Trump still being at the helm, and I'm following these polls and I'm going a little nuts, and Breonna Taylor. How are you?
Now that you give me that list, not that great. No, look,
No,
it's
it's
a
just
it's a really dark time, and you didn't even mention the story today in the Washington Post. Sorry, by Barton Gellman, who used to be at the Washington Post and the Atlantic, about these kind of genuinely attempted coup plans that Donald Trump is laying out to have Republican-led states just throw out the popular vote and substitute, their own verdict. So it's incredibly dark. And the Breonna Taylor news. I mean, the idea, charging this one officer with wanton endangerment. I mean, this is like a phrase out of Shakespeare. I don't even know what wanton
wanton
endangerment
endangerment. Wanton endangerment. I mean, I go by kids on the street every single day, and I don't know whether I'm inflicting wanton endangerment on them or they on me. But this is absurd. I mean, how could they do this with straight faces? I mean, if you want to connect the dots in terms of what you just said about planning a coup and police brutality and everything, a lot of other things that are going on here. The question is what is going on and to our democracy and to the possibilities of holding people accountable.
It was so interesting. Just a few minutes ago, I think after this grand jury decision was announced, someone posted, I think a journalist or someone posted a photograph from Louisville with militia. They looked like an occupying military force, but they were private citizens in matching uniforms with machine guns, but a private militia walking down the streets of Louisville, anticipating whatever or trying to instigate whatever. And I just had this picture of, the United States has a habit, as you know, of invading foreign countries to make them less like the United States. I mean, like we have like warlords and paramilitaries operating in this country, and the president encouraging them. We have in the Breonna Taylor case such a clear-cut example, and this is where I think while it is a criminal justice case, I think in many ways it does connect to both your and my work in a different way, which is, Rukmini Callimachi at the New York Times did this really extraordinary, detailed, painful and painstaking reconstruction of her life, and it really widened the aperture of the story, where the initial story and the story everybody's focused on about the police kicking in a completely innocent person's door in the middle of the night and shooting them. I mean, that's the obvious story and the kind of wild and maddening story. But Rukmini's piece in the Times broadened it out to look at all the ways in which the American system, the system that we have built together, we maintain together, all the ways in which all those systems bore down on her life. It wasn't just that moment. It was the difficulties of getting employed and making a decent living as a Black woman in America, the difficulty of getting the education you need. It was the men in her life who were, had very few economic options, ended up in a drug trade, and then dealt with the effects of our very unique choice among the nations of the world to do mass incarceration and criminalize drugs in the way we do. And story after story in this larger story was about all the ways in which America murdered Breonna Taylor, not just the cops, although certainly the cops as the instruments of America, but it was America that kicked in her door.
Well, here's what I worry about. The larger the frame of reference, the larger the aperture, the more we talk about systemic racism, which is what we ought to be talking about. Certainly, we need to understand all of the ways in which America murdered Breonna Taylor. But that gives us and the perpetrators an out in the sense that we aren't talking about the specific responsibilities of the officers who are actually involved, who made very specific decisions that ended her life. In other words, the paradox is that the more general we talk about systemic racism, it does enable us to see patterns. It does enable us to understand how the system is pervaded by racist thinking and racist action and institutions. But it also invites a certain cynicism at the same time, that nobody has been held accountable and nobody will be held accountable because the system is so rotten as a system. So why don't we start with one person's death and say that is unjust and outrageous, and we are not going to stand for that particular example of police brutality?
I think that's right, and I think what's been so important about, I think, the persuasive summer that the Black Lives Matter movement had, really showing movement in the opinion polls. Some of that has come a little bit back down, but actually a real advance in the percentage of Americans who have acknowledged those issues of systemic racism. There's a really important project that Black Lives Matter and others are engaged in to educate all Americans, and particularly white Americans, about the fact that racism is not something that takes place in certain moments because of ill intent. It is, as you say, the pervading atmosphere of American life, the atmosphere of the founding of this country, the very much the impetus of a lot of the provisions of our beloved Constitution. At the same time, as you say, these are specific acts of police violence that occur at a specific time and place, caused by specific police officers who commit murder, regardless of what other people choose to call it. And I think we need to hold space for calling that what it is, while acknowledging that those officers, who I think should be prosecuted for murder, to be clear, are doing it not as bad apples, but as, rotten apples within a very rotten orchard.
Well, if they're rotten apples in a rotten orchard, then yes, there's got to be a two-track response, both with regard to the apples and the orchard. But there's something else going on as well, and it has to do with power in our society in terms of the ability to respond. I was struck, Anand, I don't know if you were, but the New York Times Magazine a while back had the 1619 Project, I think they called it, with regard to devoting an entire magazine, an entire issue to Black Lives Matter, the history of racism in America, systemic racism. And then, and it was very, very persuasive, and it had a huge influence, and I think it did have, with regard to New York Times readers who tend to be, quite elite, upper middle class, coastal, it was eye opening. But then, fast forward, the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, same magazine, had another special issue. This one on corporate responsibility and corporate social responsibility. And instead of having an attitude and a frame of reference like the 1619 Project did, the New York Times had a kind of mixture. You were in it, I was in it. There were corporate executives, there were major financiers, some of whom thought that the corporation should have no responsibility. Some of them thought they should have responsibility. It was kind of a bouquet to corporate America. It was, and the contrast between those two special issues kind of continued to reverberate in my head. It was almost as if the New York Times is not afraid to exercise a little bit of leadership on the issue of racism, because it's easy to do, because the forces opposing an anti-racist stance are not really, to the New York Times at least, that threatening to the New York Times. But with regard to corporate power, which underlies a lot of other power in our society, it was almost as if the New York Times Magazine just didn't want to really take it on as they did racism. What do you think?
It's interesting. I think, first of all, the 1619 Project is just such a miraculous achievement. And it's a miraculous achievement, if it was written as a pamphlet on the street. It's a particular miraculous achievement to get that into the New York Times, which is in many ways a very small C conservative institution. I mean, you don't last 150 years in the newspaper business without being very careful, very cautious, very wary of the overclaim, very wary of the broad brushstroke. I worked there 11 years. It's a tough paper to, get the word demagogue into. And I struggled during the 2016 campaign to get the word demagogue into my column in describing Donald Trump, not because people thought he wasn't a demagogue, but because it's a careful institution. And so it was a miracle and an important cultural moment to get the 1619 Project into the paper. I have since been to events where, associations of teachers or schools across the country are all discussing the 1619 Project because it is now becoming the basis of how they teach American history. That's incredibly important. I think the observation that kind of way of honestly looking at the history of race in this country has in some ways become easier for the kind of institutions like the New York Times than a similarly bracing look at corporate power. And I think it's in a way because the Black employees of these institutions have done such a remarkable job of raising their voices, of helping people see what they can't see, of demanding change. You've had these revolts inside various media outlets on Slack with people kind of, talking openly and vulnerably about the ways in which they don't feel seen and represented by the institutions they're part of, the ways in which they feel the coverage is off. And there has been a shift. It's not enough, but there's been a shift. There have been committees there. I think on the issue of corporate power, there is a ripeness for a similar shift. I will tell you that, I know a lot of reporters, the New York Times and others, who privately are much more sympathetic to my kind of take on corporate power than their reporting shows. And they almost apologetically will be like, I can't quite write it like that, but, I totally love this stuff and whatever. And I think it's a question of we don't need New York Times reporters to become opinion columnists. That's never the smart thing to advocate. I think reporters could do a better job of figuring out the news stories to tell, the journalism to be done that would help advance the conversation in these ways. And you're seeing, the kind of investigations of labor practices that maybe you didn't see before. You're seeing it in certain types of journalism that look at money and corruption. BuzzFeed just had this thing on, money laundering around the world and drug cartels and all of that. But I think there is a real lingering aversion to not being like a shrill leftist in a lot of these papers that I understand, but that is sometimes confused with not being as ferocious and skeptical about corporate power and the corporate kind of castles of BS around CSR and the like. And that needs to change, and I hope slowly is.
But isn't the castle of BS around corporate social responsibility similar to the castle of BS around the major institutions of our society saying, oh, systemic racism is terrible, but never doing anything about it? And that is, it's so, what I'm getting at is it's so easy to condemn systemic racism. It's so easy to be indignant and engage and indulge in righteous indignation about what's happening in our society. But when it comes to actually changing the structure of power, whether we're talking about corporate power or power that the police have and those who back the police in terms of maintaining their own property and status, there is very little that changes. I don't want to appear cynical because I started this discussion with you saying we mustn't indulge in cynicism. But I worry how nothing seems to change. We've had many of these discussions before.
What's very interesting what you're saying that is I've thought about this a little bit. That I think if you think about the issues of race on the one hand and corporate power on the other, it is easier for companies to position themselves correctly on the race stuff than on the corporate power stuff, right? And they're not interested in doing anything on either. But on the race stuff, they can basically put on what I have called corporate blackface. It's really easy for a JP Morgan Chase or an Amazon or whatever to do an Instagram post saying Black Lives Matter, or, calling for some godforsaken police department in rural America to, be condemned. Because if you're JP Morgan Chase or you're Amazon, that feels far from you. Like, that's not going to come for you. Like, you're affirming a value that is quite easy for you to affirm and costless. What you don't do as Amazon or JP Morgan is, like, you don't pay Black people any more than you were paying them before. You don't stop evading the taxes that have a disproportionate effect in starving, public services that affect and help the Black community. You don't, stop the kind of lobbying, bottle service public policy that hurts consumers and hurts the most marginalized consumers the most and leaves them the most defenseless from your predatory loans or predatory products. So it's this kind of cheap and easy way of seeming like you're on the right side of things. Now, on the corporate power thing, you're seeing a similar thing where, all this kind of woke capitalism. We're doing corporate social responsibility. We're doing philanthropy. Maybe we can get into Jeff Bezos now. Like, Jeff Bezos today, announces that he's creating the Bezos Academy, this free preschool for low-income children. And my immediate reaction was like, but dude, the children are low income because you don't pay their parents enough. Like, you made them low income. Like, you're the guy, like you why are you creating a school for people who don't have money because you and your friends don't give them enough money?
Well, exactly. It's like JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon being, talking about how important it is to give particularly poor Black people every opportunity and make sure that they have the educational resources and they have all of the infrastructure they need. And JP Morgan Chase is investing, quote unquote, in some of those poor Black communities. And then you ask JP Morgan, well, what are you paying your frontline tellers, your bank tellers, many of whom are Black people and women? And it turns out they're paying almost nothing. I mean, it's exactly the same phenomenon. I was struck by Wells Fargo, the CEO, Charlie Scharf. He was asked recently about why there isn't more diversity among the executives of Wells Fargo. And he said he blamed it on a very, quote, a very limited pool of Black talent to recruit from, unquote. What? I mean, he apologized. He subsequently apologized for that comment. But
when these banks want to defraud customers, when they want to foreclose on people, when they want to sell subprime mortgages, they have no problem locating Black people. It's just, in fact, by the millions. It's just when they want to hire one or two. Apparently, Black people are somehow nowhere to be found in the United States of America. And by the way, I mean, Jamie Dimon, your most recent book, The System, one of the things I most love about it, as I've said before, is it takes this abstract issue of the system and really personalizes it by, you writing personally to Jamie Dimon, who's the embodiment of the system, not only the head of a bank, but the head of the Business Roundtable, which is the kind of plutocrats association of America. It's the CEO's club, of all the big company CEOs. And I don't know if you saw this story this week. So when last August, I guess 13 months ago, the Business Roundtable made this big announcement that apparently they were done with shareholder-focused capitalism. They were now going to do stakeholder capitalism. And, a lot of people in the American power elite, a lot of people, including non-corporate people, were totally conned by it. They were like, wow, this is a big, big deal. They are renouncing shareholder capitalism. You and me and, you know, some other people were more skeptical. I got the same kind of phone call from Jamie Dimon that you once got, that actually you wrote about in your book, because I gave a skeptical quote in the New York Times, and he was like, why are you so skeptical? This is real. And I was like, why don't you put in the law if it's real? Why don't you make it the law? Push for it to be the law that you can't hurt communities as part of the course of doing business. He didn't like that. So now a year later, the study's been commissioned. That was a business-friendly study, not like Bernie Sanders didn't do the study. It was done by some companies. I think Ford Foundation was involved. And the study finds that with coronavirus hitting, one of the first opportunities where, you know, these principles of caring for community could hit the road, turns out these companies did not. Turns out signing the statement had, you know, no effect in making the companies better behaved. And so I just was curious what you thought of that confirmation of the obvious coming in.
Well, you know, I think it goes beyond hypocrisy. This is not about business executives saying one thing and doing another. Anybody who expected them to do anything other than maximize shareholder returns was living in another universe. I mean, what's amazing is that they get away with saying things that are purely corporate hype and PR to begin with. I mean, another dimension of this same phenomenon, and I don't know whether you find it as offensive as I do, is that we've got a takeover going on right now of the Supreme Court. You know, in the wake of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you've got Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump, and every Republican senator lining up to put a sixth Republican on the Supreme Court. Now, where is it that the Republican Senate is bankrolled? Who bankrolls the Republican Senate? Much of the bankrolling, much of the money behind the campaigns for the Republicans has come from CEOs, from the business community, from finance, from Wall Street. They could and would likely have a huge influence if they said, wait a minute, this makes no sense. This is unfair. This is extraordinary in terms of its rejection of majority rule for a Supreme Court that is already, whose legitimacy is already questionable. We're gonna not give you all of this money unless you defer to the next president. Do what most of Americans think you ought to be doing. Do what Mitch McConnell said was his rationale in 2016. Why is the business community that talks ceaselessly about corporate social responsibility so reluctant to use any of its clout, huge bargaining power, because of all the money it puts into the Republican Party to actually lobby on behalf of anything resembling social responsibility?
You're exactly right. And I would say, you know, and if you'll indulge me, I just want to read you a couple sentences of something I posted in my newsletter, the Inc., which you all should sign up for, by the way, the .inc, Inc with a K, writer.
I'm going to do it today. You
should do it today. You know, and so one of the things I felt coming into this week was it's really, really important to explain the Supreme Court fight to people, not in a way that makes it sound like a Washington fight or just a fight about the judiciary. But this has to be, particularly if it's a winning issue for the anti-fascists in America, for a popular front against fascism, it has to be a kitchen table issue. And I just want to read you a couple of sentences of this and see if you react to it. You want your feet to hurt less at the end of the day. They want to crush the union fighting for your breaks to be longer and your pay to be higher. That's why they want to steal this seat. You want to wake up in the morning thinking about the business you're going to start. They want to wake you up in the middle of the night. They want you to wake up in the middle of the night sweating about the health benefits you'd lose if you did, so that you keep working for them. That's why they're desperate to steal the seat. You want to learn what you need to be a good citizen and get ahead in a tough economy. They want you balled and chained with debt, paying them interest forever. I think it's really, and I'd love to hear more of this from Biden and Schumer and the others in this fight, where I fear that the way this is being talked about sounds to a certain number of people in this country, including the kinds of people who are, for whatever insane reason, still undecided in this election, can risk sounding like an inside baseball fight among a bunch of Washington politicians who, universally offend them. And it's really worth remembering that these fights are about what everybody's days are actually like.
Well, that's a terribly important point. And let me put it in a slightly different way that connects it to everything else we've been talking about this half hour, Anand. And that is that it's not Democrats versus Republicans. Really, when you come down to it, when you really look at it closely, whether you're talking about police brutality, or you're talking about corporate social responsibility, or you're talking about Trump and the Republicans pulling a fast one with regard to the Supreme Court. It's not about Democrats, Republicans. It's not about partisan politics. It's about power, a power of an elite in this country that has huge wealth, that actually has overwhelmed American democracy, that is getting its way, that is becoming wealthier and more powerful by the day, versus average people and poor people and all the rest of us who are losing our grounding, who are losing our standing and our security, who are more and more vulnerable every day to an economic and political system that no longer feels like it's ours. If the Democrats want to win, they've got to talk about this. They've got to talk about power, where it is. They've got to talk about who they represent and who Donald Trump represents. They've got to talk about what is actually happening on the streets of our country. This is not just these notions of socialism versus capitalism, Antifada versus people who are protesting police violence. These are sideshows. The real show is about fundamentally who has the power and who doesn't in this country. And I don't know. I've been around, the Democratic Party for years. I don't know why they are so reluctant to talk about power, except for the possible reality that too much of the money supporting Democrats is coming from the same place that too much of the money supporting Republicans is coming from. That is big corporations and Wall Street. What do you think?
I think in different eras of American history, there is a dominant ideology, and one of the parties sometimes is the party of the dominant ideology, and everybody lives under that, even though there are two parties, as you know. And so, when you were getting your start, America was under the kind of FDR dominant ideology. I mean, he was long gone, but his dominant ideology, the Democratic Party's muscular view of the power of activist government to make people's lives better, so on and so forth, was the dominant ideology from the 30s to the 70s. And if you're a Republican, you were still living in that house. Nixon created the EPA, as you know. So since then, since 1980, this kind of pivotal moment in the United States and elsewhere, you've had a flip where everybody now lives in this kind of Ronald Reagan house. I mean, the Democrats fundamentally are renters, not owners right now. The Democrats are living as Airbnb guests in Ronald Reagan's house. And the fundamental question for Democrats right now, and in this election and beyond the election, if Joe Biden wins, is do Democrats want to continue being renters? Or do they want to actually own the house? Do they want to actually have us living in another kind of house? And that requires an intellectual self-confidence, a willingness, as you say, to talk about power, a confidence in the pure, undiluted, distilled vodka version of the idea that you believe in instead of the warm beer version of the idea, whether it's, universal healthcare as opposed to whatever the hell, certain centrist plans are, whether it's, getting rid of student debt as an issue in American life, as opposed to some credits here and there. And whether it's a Green New Deal, as opposed to some wishy-washy plan to, have us narrowly avert, some fraction of the end of the world. I think Republicans have shown that actually being willing to fight the full version of your fight is actually how you you end up owning the House, setting the terms of the conversation. And I think the big question for Democrats now is like, are they willing, not just to kind of win an office, but use being in office, should that happen, which I hope to God it does, to change the game, to take back the House, and to have the next 30, 40, 50 years of American life be defined by that new intellectual paradigm.
Well, from your lips to God's ears and to the Democratic Party's ears, Anand, and let us sadly end our session right now because we don't have any more time. I was going to say we don't have any more power. That could be true as well. But let's continue this conversation. The time is ripe. I can't help but worry that if things don't change, and we're talking about what, 5 or 6 weeks now, and already people are beginning to vote in terms of early voting and absentee voting, that we could find ourselves in a conversation in a few months that is entirely different than the conversation we're now having, in which we're trying to hold on to the shards of democracy and the possibilities of a little bit of people power, where most of it actually has been gone. So fight the good fight. Thank you, Anand, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much. Always good to talk with you. And I would just say to people, remember, just take a minute, close your eyes at some point today, and imagine, visualize. I'm not a spiritual new age kind of person, but I know you're in Berkeley, but take a minute to visualize how you will feel when Wolf Blitzer or Rachel Maddow or whoever you worship gets up there and there's that big banner and it says, Donald Trump loses.
Amen. You take care.
You too. Good to see you as always.